Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a part of history no one really talks about in school: the age-old tradition of hurling insults through fruit. You're standing in a crowded medieval market square, sunlight filtering through linen awnings, the smell of sweat, spice, and sheep in your nostrils. You hear a yell. A melon smashes to the ground next to your foot. Someone shouts, "You oath-bouching turnip!" and the crowd howls. Welcome to one of the most overlooked yet juiciest chapters of public performance in the Middle Ages. You probably won't survive this if you're allergic to citrus. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're watching. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past a barrel of bruised pears, adjusting your cloak as a juggler narrowly misses your shoulder with a flying fig. It's not personal, not yet. In medieval Europe, fruit was more than just something to eat or ferment. It was a tool, a weapon even, for ridicule, rebuke, and sometimes social justice. Forget swords and shields. This was a time when your reputation could be ruined by a well-aimed plum. Imagine you're in 14th century London. A fishwife hawks her wares. A drunken mason stumbles past and slaps her backside. Without skipping a beat, she grabs a rotting apple and pegs him in the back of the head. He spins around, dazed. The crowd laughs. She's won. That apple, her closing argument. Mainstream accounts often focus on the grand gestures, duels, trials, excommunications, but daily life in the Middle Ages was messier, smellier, and far more creative. Fruit was abundant, visible, and perishable, perfect for impulsive displays of mockery, especially because it left no permanent scar. Well, unless it was a melon. Historians still argue whether the act of fruit-throwing stemmed more from theatrical tradition or raw necessity. After all, many public squares lacked formal policing. If someone cut the line, insulted your mother, or wore their hat inside the church, there wasn't a Yelp review coming. There was just you and the squishy tomato in your basket. And it wasn't all chaos. There was unspoken protocol. You didn't just lob a pear at a priest, not unless you were asking for a week in the stocks and an eternal scolding from your grandmother. No, this fruit-flung ridicule was often tactical, used in moments when social rules allowed for creative expression. Weddings gone wrong, court jesters losing the room, bakers selling bread like bricks. You had to earn your fruit. One often forgotten fringe tidbit: in parts of what is now southern Germany, market magistrates actually set aside an afternoon each month for public expression in the town square. Citizens could bring complaints, insults, and even physical demonstrations of anger, often using fruit. Think of it like open mic night, but with pomegranates. And of course, medieval people weren't above exaggeration. One chronicler in 1298 describes an incident where a woman struck her cheating husband's mistress with a pail of cherries, staining her bodice and her soul. The bodice part is confirmed. The soul? That's probably editorial license. Still, fruit was everywhere, which meant it was easy to grab and symbolic in a way words sometimes weren't. If you threw a plum, you weren't just mad. You were calling someone overripe, spoiled and soft. A lemon, sour-tempered and sharp. A turnip, that was an insult of intellect, thick, dumb, slow-growing. They didn't say dunce, they said radish brain. Let's not forget the pageantry. In Florence, during the feast of Saint Reparata, crowds would gather to celebrate with games, music, and fruit skirmishes. Participants wore padded hoods. Oranges were thrown, shins were bruised, tempers flared. A young man who got hit 3 times before noon would be expected to reflect on his pride in the confessional booth. And then there's you. You're standing by the fig cart when a boy trips and his basket goes flying. Dried dates scatter like pebbles. Someone yells, "Witch!" for reasons entirely unclear, and suddenly half the market erupts into a citrus free-for-all. You duck, spin, and find yourself face to face with an old woman calmly eating a bruised pear, eyes full of judgment. "That one was aimed at your pride," she says. "Did it land?" One documented case from 1403 in Rouen involved a man hurling an underripe plum at a tax collector and then loudly apologizing for not choosing a more appropriate variety. Satire. Meat snack. Why fruit, though? Why not mud or bones or chicken legs? Simple. It was common, symbolic, and it left a mark, socially and physically, without being lethal. You insulted with fruit because you wanted someone shamed, not dead. Public ridicule was a pressure valve in a world without therapy or Twitter. So next time you peel an orange, think of it less as a snack and more as a slice of medieval communication. Somewhere 7 centuries ago, someone made a point with that citrus, and probably got slapped for it. You're walking the muddy lanes of Bruges on a drizzly Tuesday morning, and ahead of you a commotion stirs near the fruit vendor's cart. But unlike the riotous scene from earlier, this time nobody's throwing anything just yet. A tension hangs in the air. Someone has insulted improperly, and in the medieval world, that's almost worse than not insulting at all. Believe it or not, fruit-based mockery wasn't just slapstick chaos, it followed a strange, shifting etiquette. The medieval world operated on hierarchies, traditions, and sometimes superstition. So, of course, the act of pelting someone with produce was governed by a kind of unspoken but well-understood code of conduct. Call it the fruity code of chivalry. First, timing. You couldn't just throw fruit during a funeral, for example, unless the deceased really deserved it, and even then, only during the eulogy, never the procession. Weddings, fair game, after the vows, especially if there were rumors about the bride's dowry or the groom's lack of vigor, and at public punishments like a man in the pillory, oh yes, fruit was practically expected. Anything firmer than a plum, though, was frowned upon. Nobody wanted to see a nose broken by a turnip. Well, almost nobody. Then there was the matter of distance. From close up, a fig could be a stinging rebuke. From across the square, it became an accusation. Context mattered. And yes, trajectory mattered too. If you hit someone while looking away, that was cowardice. If you made eye contact, threw underhand, and still landed it square in their goblet, respect. Historians still argue whether these fruit-throwing customs were regionally specific or part of a wider European trend. Some claim Italy, particularly the Tuscan states, elevated the practice into its own ritual art. Others argue England had the richest vocabulary for it. One 14th century glossary includes the phrase, "a pear's worth, oh shame," apparently a shorthand insult among apprentices. Let's get into the fruit itself. Not all fruit was equal. You couldn't just grab whatever was closest and expect your insult to land the same way. Each fruit had its own associations. Apples, safe, versatile, a bit bland, used in bulk by crowds, especially against tacksmen and late-arriving minstrels. Figs, rich with symbolic insult, especially after the church labeled the fig sign, a crude hand gesture involving your thumb, as vulgar. Throwing one was doubly offensive. Grapes, Reserved for flirty teasing or satire, they were delicate after all, perfect for implying someone's softness. Lemons. Bold. Sharp. You didn't throw a lemon unless you meant to question someone's entire temperament. Turnips and radishes. Borderline aggressive, used when intelligence or moral character was being insulted. These were vegetable insults dressed as fruit. And never, ever throw a cherry. Those were associated with maidenhood and sweetness. Tossing a cherry was like flipping off a puppy. But who decided this stuff? The crowd mostly. Medieval societies were surprisingly good at creating communal understanding without writing everything down. Much like meme culture today, you didn't need a handbook to know that a banana slipped under a bishop's saddle wasn't just a prank. It was ecclesiastical commentary. Quirky detail incoming in 1311 during a midsummer feast in Norwich. A baker's apprentice was tried before the town council for inciting mockery with a plum. Apparently he threw it not at a person, but at a statue of Saint Benedict, shouting, "May the holy man forgive this overripe offering." Was it satire? Heresy? Hunger? Hard to say. The plum was confiscated and eaten by the scribe, who called it a satisfactory witness. And then there were the informal rules of escalation. You didn't go straight to a melon. Oh no. You began with a withering glance, maybe a muttered insult. Then came a soft fruit, a squishy pear or a split fig. Only if the argument truly deepened would you escalate to something harder. The cantaloupe? That was war. A folktale from eastern France tells of two rival cheese vendors who spent 7 years throwing increasingly elaborate fruit combinations into each other's shop windows. It ended not with violence, but with a duel fought entirely in gooseberries. No one knows who won, but the town records confirm both men were fined for excessive tartness. There were also gender-based rules. Women were not usually pelted with fruit in public. That was considered poor form, unless the woman in question was either A, a known adulteress, or B, a tax collector, in which case all bets were off. Similarly, older women wielding fruit were sometimes feared. They were seen as keepers of ancient shame rituals, like the baker's widow in Ghent, who reportedly chased debtors with a string of dried apricots tied to her belt, cursing them with every swing. Scholars still debate whether such codes were taught formally, perhaps passed from mother to daughter, or whispered in the shadows of guild halls, or whether they emerged spontaneously, encoded through repetition and observation. And here's the weirdest bit. Some towns even had fruit zones. These were areas where hurling insults via plum or peach was permitted, usually just outside the main market. Think of them as the Renaissance version of free speech zones. There's a surviving parchment from 1452 in Bologna, outlining the dimensions of the fructum plataea fruit plaza, where grievances could be expressed in symbolic produce, not exceeding 3 palms in diameter. So now, as you shuffle past another fish cart, breathing through your sleeve, you begin to appreciate just how organized all this chaos really was. Medieval people weren't just winging fruit. They were communicating in a strangely elegant system of class, symbolism, and social commentary. It was all in the throw, the choice, the moment. You glance at the woman across the street. She's just dropped an apple at someone's feet. Not thrown, just dropped. A statement. A soft insult. And like everyone else watching, you nod. You understand. You hear the squelch before you see it. A mushy apple lands squarely against the velvet doublet of a plump clergyman. He stops mid-stride, cheeks blooming red beneath his tonsured head, and scans the crowd. Somewhere, someone has just committed a subtle act of social rebellion. Welcome to the fruity caste system. In the medieval world, your social role wasn't just defined by your title or wealth. It was also reflected in the fruit you were most likely to be hit with. It wasn't random, oh no. Certain fruits were assigned unofficially but unmistakably to particular walks of life. A fig for a thief, a pear for a gossip, an apple for the clergy. Like horoscopes made of vitamin C, these associations guided the public's choice of projectile. Take that clergyman, for instance. Apples were commonly aimed at members of the clergy, not out of disrespect per se, but because apples symbolized both knowledge and temptation. You remember the story. Eve, the serpent, the snack that doomed mankind. So when Brother Oswald makes yet another sermon about sin while pocketing donations from the widow's fund, tossing an apple is not just mischief, it's scripture-based sarcasm. Historians still argue whether this fruit person symbolism emerged organically or was reinforced by ecclesiastical teachings. Some suggest it was a clever form of layperson resistance. If you couldn't challenge the priest in words, you could throw him theology disguised as lunch. Figs, on the other hand, were meant for thieves. Not because they were especially painful, they weren't, but because of the fig's older, less innocent meaning. In Roman times, a fig could symbolize lasciviousness. Over time, it took on undertones of dishonor, even dirtiness. In the medieval fig lexicon, to be figged meant to be publicly humiliated or accused of wrongdoing, especially stealing. You didn't fig a baker for bad bread. You figged him because you knew he shorted the weights on the scales. And don't get started on pears. The pear was the passive-aggressive queen of fruit insults. It said, "I know what you did and so does everyone else, but I'm too refined to yell about it." Pears were often lobbed at chatty midwives, opinionated tailors, or anyone who had ideas above their station. It bruised easily, sure, but so did pride. Quirky detail for the night. In 1390 in the Low Countries, there's a record of a merchant named Pieter de Groot, who was struck not once but 4 times in the span of 1 hour, with a different fruit each time. An apple, he underpaid the monks. A fig, his leggers were shady. A pear, he insulted a weaver's daughter. And finally, a blackened banana, whose meaning is to this day a complete mystery to historians. The last fruit is without context, the scribe wrote dryly. Peter survived, barely. And let's not forget the plums. Plums were dramatic. You threw a plum when you wanted people to notice. Purple, juicy, and often carried in handkerchiefs to preserve their splatter, they were favorites of courtesans and performers, especially when mocking the wealthy. A well-aimed plum at a baron's son could start a duel, or a romance. Open scholarly debate. Some researchers believe these fruit assignments varied wildly by region, while others argue there was a Europe-wide understanding of what each fruit meant. The truth? Probably a bit of both. In Italy, for instance, the lemon was tied to venomous gossip. In Spain, a quince meant you talk too much. In England, an apricot was a backhanded compliment, sweet on the outside, full of stone beneath. And what about the real troublemakers? They didn't just follow the rules, they twisted them. In Paris, one noblewoman, name unfortunately lost to history, was known for attending public events with a fruit basket trimmed in lace. She'd watch the unfolding drama and, at just the right moment, hand someone the fruit they should be throwing. Think of her as a passive-aggressive sommelier for social scandal. There's a fragment of a poem, believed to be from Wales, that captures the nuance. An apple for a preacher, ripe and red with lies. A fig for a lover with 2 mouths and 3 eyes. A pear for a neighbor who borrows, then denies, and a plum for the jester who never replies. Modern audiences might chuckle at the idea of a society where fruit flinging had such nuance, But it's worth remembering these people didn't have newspapers, Twitter, or stand-up comedy. They had markets, feast days, and the occasional melon to deliver their point. And speaking of melons, those were never casual. Melons were weapons of final resort. If someone got hit with a melon, it was either an accident or a declaration of social obliteration. You could throw a pear and get a slap. A melon? That might bring down the town watch. One curious case from Prague describes a baker being chased out of town after being pelted with a cascade of cantaloupes, a punishment not for his bread, but for his terrible singing during feast day. The cantaloupes, says the record, were intended not to injure the body, but to silence the soul. Ouch. So, next time you see a humble pear or the lowly fig in a market stall, remember, in the right hands, that wasn't food, it was commentary, and like the best commentary, it wasn't always polite. You wander on, the memory of that priest's apple-streaked robe fresh in your mind. Around you the marketplace buzzes with movement, murmurs, and the soft thunk of a plum landing somewhere out of sight. You follow the sound of angry shouts down a side alley, past a cluster of boys kicking around a deflated wineskin. The air is thick with the scent of cabbage, wood smoke, and, yes, bruised citrus. And then you see it. A crushed melon sprawled across the cobblestones, seeds gleaming like tiny white eyes. A trail of sticky pulp leads up the steps of the guild hall. Above it all stands a butcher, with pulp on his doublet and a righteous fury in his stance. He's not holding a sword, he's holding what's left of a very expensive orange. You've arrived just in time for the squish heard round the square. This wasn't your everyday fruit fling. This was the scandal of the season, the one that got scribes talking and nobles gossiping over mead. It began, as most great medieval feuds do, with bread prices. A baker, Thomas of Kent, was notorious for cutting corners. His loaves were hollow, his flour stretched with chalk, and his prices steep. On the day of the annual bread fair, a highly anticipated event where bakers competed for prestige and customers, Thomas unveiled his signature walnut loaf, which was, according to multiple reports, aggressively average. And yet, when the awards were handed out by the aldermen, 3 bald men with gravy-stained sleeves, Thomas was awarded second prize. The square fell silent. Second prize, ahead of Mistress Aldworth, who'd spent 3 nights fermenting her dough over rosemary and prayers, ahead of blind old Martin, whose crusts could cut glass, ahead of everyone. The murmuring began, then the shouting, and then someone, anonymous of course, threw a melon. Historians still argue whether it was a honeydew or a musk variety. The impact, however, is well documented. The melon struck Thomas directly in the chest, exploded in a spray of rind and shame, and knocked his ridiculous hat clean off. The crowd roared. Someone else threw a fig. A handful of overripe berries followed. It escalated with the speed of a tavern brawl. The baker fell. The mayor stood to intervene, slipped on a plum, and broke his dignity. The award was revoked, the fair was cancelled, and Thomas never showed his doughy face in that market again. Now here's the juicy fringe tidbit. The town friar, Father Brutus, later incorporated the event into his sermons. "Let not your heart be puffed like false bread," he said, "lest the Lord deliver unto thee the melon of truth." The line was so popular that scribes in nearby towns began copying it into their own homilies. One particularly theatrical monk even used fruit during his Easter vigil to demonstrate the perils of pride. The melon, tragically, hit the candle and set his robe on fire. He survived. His dignity, not so much. You take a moment here to reflect. The weaponized fruit was more than spectacle. It was consequence. In a world where legal recourse was sluggish and bribery common, the public sometimes took justice into their own sticky hands. Throwing fruit became a way to shame the untouchable. You couldn't jail a corrupt baker, but you could pelt him with produce until his social standing crumbled faster than his soggy crust. Medieval towns even had unwritten escalation thresholds. A single fruit meant annoyance, a barrage meant public censure, and if the bell of the market square rang during the throwing, that was effectively a formal vote of, "We're done with you." In the case of Thomas, the bell was rung twice, once accidentally by a fleeing child, and once by the mayor himself, likely to save face after the plum incident. Open scholarly debate. Did incidents like this represent a form of proto-democracy, where public opinion shaped authority? Or were they just medieval tantrums in fancy hats? Some argue that these public fruit trials replaced the older, more violent traditions of mob punishment. Better to be hit with a peach than stoned with slate. And don't underestimate the long-term effects. For months after the bread fair scandal, children in the village played a game called Melon Thomas, which involved pretending to fall down and yell, "Not the loaf, not the loaf!" A cruel legacy, but undeniably catchy. The event even inspired a song, sung to the tune of a popular drinking chant. It went, "O Thomas, thou baker, thy crust be a jest. With melon we smite thee, for fraud we detest. Thy loaves are as hollow as promises made, and the seeds of thy pride now rot in the shade." Not exactly Billboard Top 40, but it spread. By winter, versions of the song were sung as far as Bristol, often with dancers miming the fateful fruit throw. One wandering minstrel, known only as Geoffrey the Sticky, made a career of reenacting the squish for coin and cackle. It's funny, isn't it? In an age ruled by rigid order, feudal hierarchies, divine right, church authority, there still had to be some release valve, and fruit, glorious fruit, became the medium of the people. Its rot was righteous, its splatter symbolic. You pass a wall now where someone's painted a faded melon with legs chasing a man in a baker's hat. A crude drawing, but the meaning is clear. Melons don't forget. And neither does the square. Though the fair has returned, there's a permanent rule on the books. No melons shall be sold or displayed upon bread fair day. The logic? No one trusts a peaceful melon anymore. You walk on. Somewhere behind you, a merchant is arguing over figs. And in your hand, without realizing it, you've been clutching a pear, just in case. You step through a quiet archway into a cloistered garden, the noise of the market slipping away behind ivy-covered stone. The air changes, cooler, still, damp with the scent of mint and marjoram. A gravel path winds between carefully tended fruit trees, apples, plums, a single defiant fig. You're in a monastery, a place of prayer, study, and, oddly enough, theatrical fruit insults. Welcome to the strange world of citrus and sin in the monastery garden. Now, you wouldn't expect monks, those champions of silence and humility, to be entangled in the fruity art of social critique, but they absolutely were. Not by hurling plums across the chapel, well, usually not, but through writing, performance, and sometimes a quiet, passive-aggressive pear placed exactly where it didn't belong. Monastic life was rigid, full of rules. You rose early, prayed often, and tried not to complain when Brother Elias sang 2 notes off-key during matins for the 4th week in a row. But monks were human, and humans, especially bored, educated ones, find ways to make their point. Let's start with their favorite method, metaphor. Medieval monastic texts are stuffed with fruit imagery, most of it only thinly veiled. A lazy monk might be described as a worm-eaten apple in the Lord's basket. A prideful abbot, a pear grown bloated on its own weight. And don't get them started on figs. One 13th century scribe scrawled in the margins of a psalter, "Beware the fig of false friendship, it splits when squeezed." Historians still argue whether this fruity lexicon evolved from Scripture itself, think the tree of knowledge, the fruit of the Spirit, or from agricultural metaphors popular in the surrounding countryside. Either way, it blossomed into an entire language of low-key judgment, spoken behind folded hands and closed doors. One particularly colorful example comes from a monastery in northern Spain, where the annual feast of St. Isidore involved a fruit morality play. The story? A young monk is tempted by the 7 fruits of sin, the slippery fig of lust, the sour lemon of wrath, the rotten apple of pride, and so on. It ends, predictably, with him tripping over a pomegranate of gluttony and falling flat in the mud before repenting under a pear tree. Critics called it excessively direct. The audience loved it. And then there's the quiet rebellion of the orchard. Monks grew their own fruit, tending vines and trees with meticulous care. But sometimes fruit would be left deliberately to rot. Why? Because the monk who managed that tree was being punished, or because the abbot disapproved of the gardener's behavior, or, more interestingly, because letting a pear fall and splatter by someone's bedchamber door said more than words ever could. Quirky detail time. At the Abbey of St. Vitus, a novice was once caught sneaking into the kitchen for extra honeycakes. His punishment? A week of gardening duty. Except the elder monk made him care for a single, perpetually sour lemon tree no one liked. The lemon's name, apparently, was Gregory. No one knows why. And don't underestimate the weaponization of gifts. In monastic communities, the offering of fruit could be sincere or scathing. Giving someone a bowl of underripe plums was a polite way of saying your sermon was unripe too. A single flawless apple on a bench might signal admiration, or a gentle reminder that one's behavior should live up to their robes. There's a beautiful record from a Cistercian monastery describing a silent confrontation between 2 monks, Brother Toma, stern and scholarly, and Brother Peter, mischievous and prone to naps. Toma, finding yet another chore left undone, placed a bruised pear, nothing more, on Peter's pillow. No words were exchanged, but that evening the floors were swept, the candles trimmed, and Brother Peter's choir posture was immaculate. That's the power of fruit-based passive aggression. Open scholarly debate. Some researchers believe these symbolic acts were codified, that abbeys passed down a kind of secret etiquette guide, an inner fruit glossary for behavior and reprimand. Others argue it was purely cultural osmosis. The truth, as always, is probably fermenting somewhere in between. And yes, occasionally things did get physical. In one manuscript, a marginal note tells of a scriptorium dispute where 2 monks came to blows with apples after accusing each other of hoarding the good quills. It's unclear whether the apples were thrown or used as makeshift clubs, but either way the abbot banned apple trees within 50 paces of the dormitories shortly thereafter. But more often the insults were quieter. A monk might carve a cherry pit with an unflattering caricature of the cellarer and leave it on the refectory table. A fig might be placed in someone's laundry with a note reading, "For your spiritual nourishment." And once, in a truly elaborate display of ecclesiastical trolling, a monk arranged an entire fruit tableau of the Last Supper, using only overripe bananas. The meaning remains obscure, but the punishment was swift. What does all this mean for you, wandering beneath the branches of a pear tree as bells toll in the distance? It means even in the most devout spaces, fruit found a way to speak, to shame, to soothe, to say what couldn't be said aloud. A fig on a bench was worth 100 whispered criticisms. And now, as you leave the garden, a single apple falls from a branch above, landing near your feet with a soft thump. Is it a coincidence? Or is Brother Elias watching from behind the cloister wall, silently judging your boots? You'll never know. You're back in the bustle now, emerging from monastic peace into the chaos of a full-blown market day. It's noon, the sun is high, and the noise is an orchestra of barter, bleating, and brawling. A cabbage rolls across your path like a green grenade. You sidestep just in time to avoid an airborne pomegranate. Welcome to when markets turn medieval, fight clubs, where fruit wasn't just for sale, it was for war. Market days in medieval towns were the closest thing to reality TV you could get. Drama, betrayal, loud commentary, and the occasional slapstick tragedy. Vendors hawked, musicians played, thieves darted, and somewhere, always, someone got smacked with produce. Today's scene, a fishmonger's stall, smells like brine and old boots. A line of customers snakes around crates of haddock and eel. A young boy tugs at his mother's sleeve, pointing. "That's the one who watered the fish last week," he whispers. Rumor has it, the vendor keeps a flask under the table, to keep the fish fresh, of course. The crowd begins to murmur. Then, from 2 stalls over, a tomato sails through the air. Historians still argue whether this kind of spontaneous market justice emerged naturally from community frustration, or if it was a vestige of older folk customs. Some see it as performative justice, a chance for commoners to enforce standards in the absence of reliable law enforcement. Others claim it was less about justice, more about entertainment. After all, nothing draws a crowd like someone being pelted with peaches. And it wasn't always serious. Sometimes the fights were just tradition. Take the village of Halvergate, England. Every spring during lambing fair, the produce stalls would erupt into a friendly fray, half sport, half social equalizer. One chronicler described the event as a splendid muddle of merchants, turnips, and bruised pride. Everyone knew it was coming. Some vendors even brought extra fruit just for throwing. Unripe pears were favorites, heavy enough to fly straight, soft enough not to blind. One quirky anecdote from 1377 tells of 2 rival egg sellers in Bruges who escalated a pricing dispute with lemons. Not eggs, lemons. One stall began placing lemons around the other's goods, insinuating sourness and rot. The other responded by slicing oranges into passive-aggressive wedges and handing them out to customers with the phrase, "for clarity." Eventually, a scuffle broke out, and both women were fined for unholy zest. But it wasn't just vendor versus vendor. Customers joined in too. A baker shortchanged your aunt. You waited a week, then returned with a bruised quince hidden in your sleeve. A blacksmith muttered something crude about your cousin. Boom! A gooseberry to the knee. Open scholarly debate. Was this communal violence or community theater? Some suggest medieval market fights functioned like pressure valves, non-lethal, highly symbolic, and cathartic. Others warn against romanticizing them, noting that not everyone had equal fruit-flinging privileges. Nobles, clergy, and wealthy merchants were generally off-limits, unless they were very unpopular and someone else threw the first fruit. And naturally, it sometimes got way out of hand. In 1419, a fruit fight in Lyon started when a vendor was caught slipping sand into his fig baskets. The crowd's outrage spread faster than a feast day rumor. Grapes, peaches, even dried plums soared through the air. 2 chickens were reportedly launched as well, although that may be an embellishment. The bishop, attempting to calm the mob, was struck in the face with an olive. He declared it a divine intervention and ordered 3 days of fasting. The vendor was banned from the market, and Lyon's annual fair gained an unofficial nickname, the Festival of the Fig Fraud. And let's not forget the truly theatrical merchants who leaned into the chaos. One Italian vendor, known only as Marco of Many Melons, would deliberately provoke competitors into fruit-throwing duels, knowing it would attract curious customers. He carried a small shield made of woven fig branches and claimed, "Any tomato that touches me blesses my wares." He was either brilliant or utterly mad, possibly both. Quirky moment. In a French market circa 1450, a visiting poet attempted to defend a dishonored cheese seller by composing a spontaneous ballad mid-fruit fight. He was hit with 3 apples before the second stanza. The poem, lost to history. The bruises, probably unforgettable. You duck as a woman next to you lobs an apricot with surprising precision. It thuds against a cartwheel, splattering politely. No one bats an eye. This is normal, expected. It's not about rage, it's about rhythm. If the market is a song, then fruit fights are the percussion. And the crowd always knows when things shift from jest to genuine threat. You feel it, the change in tone, the narrowed eyes. The silence after a particularly heavy squash splatters too close to a child. That's when a constable might step in, swinging his baton like a priest swatting flies. But the moment passes. The danger fades. A lemon rolls to your feet. You nudge it aside. Around you, the market sways back into its regular chaos. Bargaining, laughter, the sharp bark of a dog chasing geese. You glance upward. A vendor has arranged his apples in a careful, towering pyramid. A challenge? An act of trust? Or bait for the next scuffle? It doesn't matter. The rules are simple. You throw if you must. You dodge if you can. And you never, ever waste a perfectly good cherry. You wander deeper into the festival district, where market stalls begin to blur with music, laughter, and the scent of roasting almonds. Someone hands you a candied pear. You nod politely, bite in, and instantly regret it. It's dry, chalky, suspiciously familiar. You'd just been mocked through fruit, and you didn't even see it coming. Welcome to fruit's secret role in courtship and mockery, where the line between flirtation and insult was as thin as apple skin, and often just as bruised. In the medieval world, fruit wasn't just food or insult fodder. It was layered with meaning, particularly when passed between hands. A gift of cherries could melt a heart, or imply someone's sweetness was all for show. A pomegranate might represent fertility, or hint at someone spreading themselves too generously across town. And a plum? Well, if someone gave you a plum in public, you were either being courted or accused of being soft in the head. This duality was part of the charm. Fruit was a way to say what couldn't be said aloud, especially in matters of the heart. In societies where courtship was stifled by propriety, supervision, and poorly lit streets, lovers had to be inventive. A simple fruit basket could carry entire paragraphs of subtext. Let's paint a scene. You're at a spring fair. Musicians play beneath fluttering pennants. A noble woman in blue silk passes a young knight a bowl of cherries, each one meticulously polished. He smiles. The crowd sighs. Then she lifts a single grape, squishes it gently between thumb and forefinger, and drops it at his feet. Gasps all around. Translation: Your Honor, fragile. Historians still argue whether these gestures were widely understood or depended on local culture and gossip. Some claim there were informal fruit codes taught among young women and passed along like embroidery patterns. Others argue that meanings shifted wildly between regions and sometimes between people, which was half the fun. Take, for instance, the three-plum problem. In parts of the Low Countries, 3 plums tied with red ribbon were a courting gift, symbolizing loyalty, pleasure, and wealth. But in northern France, the exact same gesture was a subtle insult, implying the recipient was greedy, lusty, and fond of lying about money. You can imagine the drama this caused at intervillage festivals. And of course, this ambiguity was weaponized. In one court record from 1422, a merchant's daughter in Prague claimed she'd been publicly shamed after receiving a fig pie from a suitor. Why? Because figs were by then closely associated with base desires. She claimed the gesture implied she was no better than a barmaid. The suitor insisted it was just the only thing he knew how to bake. The judge ruled in favor of restorative pastry. He had to deliver a more chaste dessert. Apples and walnuts, as it turned out, were considered morally neutral. And let's not ignore the performance of it all. Courtiers in particular used fruit theatrically. At feasts and dances, a well-placed slice of peach could indicate favor. A rejected orange segment, returned untouched, was social devastation. There's even a 15th century Spanish play in which the lead character carries on an entire flirtation using only different preparations of plum, whole, stewed, dried, and finally exploded into jam as an expression of heartbreak. Quirky fringe detail. In Hungary, there's a record of a village matchmaker who used a fruit compatibility chart to determine marriage potential. Apples and quinces meant a stable match. Grapes and pears, volatile but passionate. Melons and figs, not advised. She was either brilliant or very bored, possibly both. One of the most delicate rituals involved pomegranates. If a suitor gave one to a maiden unopened, it symbolized hope, patience, and potential. If he handed it over already cracked, that was suggestive. A scandalized monk once wrote that a cracked pomegranate spoke louder than hands. It doesn't help that they stain. And then there's the bittersweet role of fruit in heartbreak. In some regions, returning fruit was part of the rejection process. A bruised apple might be placed on a doorstep, soft side up. A basket of pears tied with black thread meant, I enjoyed it, but goodbye. And in one particularly devastating custom, a woman would send back every cherry pit from a shared snack, counted and strung like rosary beads. One letter attached read simply, each bite now bitter. Open scholarly debate. Were these rituals officially sanctioned by families, or did they exist entirely in the liminal space between public and private life? Some scholars argue that fruit gestures allowed young people a rare measure of agency. Others suggest they served as convenient scapegoats. Oh no, mother, it was just a pear. And the gossip. Entire reputations could rise or fall based on a single fruit exchange. A young scribe in Rouen was once accused of forbidden correspondence after delivering a fig-wrapped love note. When questioned, he insisted the note had been for his aunt, and the fig was medicinal. He was reassigned to inventory duty and never married. You pass a cart selling candied plums now, and you hesitate. The vendor grins, offering one free. You remember the dusty pear from earlier. Is this kindness or commentary? You accept anyway. You chew slowly. Somewhere nearby a harp plays. A girl drops a single cherry pit into a fountain and walks away. Fruit doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the whole truth either. You find yourself now beneath the carved arches of a banquet hall. dimly lit by flickering tallow candles and the occasional gleam of polished silver. The air smells like roast venison, spiced wine, and ambition. Around you, lords and envoys laugh too loudly and sip too slowly, each word carefully placed, each gesture a calculated move in the long game of politics. Welcome to the politics of pears and pomegranates, where fruit wasn't just food, it was diplomatic weaponry. At first glance, a feast in a medieval court might seem like mere indulgence, long tables piled high with meats, stews, pastries, and of course, fruit. But look closer. That bowl of pears wasn't chosen for flavor. That pomegranate beside the ambassador's goblet, absolutely intentional. Because in the politics of the medieval elite, fruit became a kind of edible code, silent, subtle, and potentially devastating. Picture this, it's the winter of 1389, and two rival duchies have finally agreed to meet after months of border raids and botched negotiations. The table is set, silver glints, wines are poured, and there, at each place setting, is a single piece of fruit. For one side, crisp, perfect apples, symbolizing truth, clarity, maybe even surrender. For the other, overripe pears, suggesting softness, overconfidence, or perhaps decay. Guess which side took offense? Historians still argue whether these fruit placements were the result of coincidence, kitchen sabotage, or high-level psychological warfare. Some believe court stewards deliberately curated fruit trays to signal the hosting lord's true opinion of his guests. Others argue the guests themselves often read insult into nothing, seeing rot where there was only ripeness. But the truth is, fruit mattered, especially in a setting where saying the wrong thing could start a war, or worse, a poetry duel. Take pomegranates. In southern Europe, they symbolized abundance, fertility, even divine order. But place one cracked open next to a guest? That could be interpreted as a commentary on their fractured alliances, or their numerous offspring, or their loose grasp on power. One quirky account from the court of King René of Anjou tells of a visiting envoy who was served a tart of cherries arranged into the unmistakable shape of his family's disgraced crest. He smiled politely. The next morning he left without comment and doubled his army's presence at the border. And pears, those sly, buttery curveballs of diplomacy, were everywhere. A gift of pears could be an offering of peace, or an insult to your judgment, or a subtle nudge that someone's military strength was softening. A court poem from Burgundy describes a noblewoman who rejected a duke's proposal by sending back a single pear, sliced lengthwise and salted. Her message: "I see the core and it's bitter." Quirky detail: in 1446, the court of Aragon banned the serving of melons at diplomatic banquets, not because of allergies, because in previous years, 3 separate treaties had collapsed following feasts where someone interpreted a melon's presence as an accusation of bloated pride. One particularly round cantaloupe, it seems, had caused international offense. And let's not forget the audience. At these banquets, everyone was watching. Courtiers took mental notes. Scribes quietly recorded who received what. A bowl of grapes? A sign of indulgence. An underripe peach? A judgment on your etiquette. Even the peelings mattered. One Italian noble was rumored to judge a rival's future by how he handled a sticky orange rind. Open scholarly debate: were these fruit signals understood universally by medieval elites, or did they vary by region, language, and court culture? Some argue that a pear meant the same thing in Paris as it did in Prague. Others claim that meaning was shaped entirely by local gossip and recent scandal, making every fruit gesture a gamble. And of course, Sometimes it wasn't about symbolism at all. Sometimes it was theater. In the Hungarian court, jesters were occasionally employed to, accidentally, drop fruit into laps. Symbolic, yes, but also a way to break tension, provoke laughter, or test someone's temper. One document describes a banquet prank where an envoy's goblet was swapped with one carved entirely from dried fig paste. It collapsed in his hand mid-set. The hall fell silent. Then he laughed, declared it the sweetest betrayal I've ever tasted, and the alliance held, barely. Fruit also played a role in seating politics. To sit beside a dish of plums was to be seen as trusted. Near lemons, risky. Near grapes and walnuts, probably harmless. But if the fruit bowl between you and the host contained both apples and pears, well, you were being watched closely. And remember, in this world, nothing was accidental. Even the type of preserved fruit offered could send a message. Candied orange peels were rare and luxurious, offering them implied favor or flattery. Dried figs were common, practical, and boring. Offering only figs? That might suggest your presence wasn't worth fresh fruit. And here's the kicker, not every insult was caught. That was the beauty of it. You could always claim innocence. "Oh, no, Your Grace, I had no idea that a pear meant anything at all." Smile, nod, pass the plum. So now, as you stand in the shadows of this echoing hall, watching a steward place a single glossy apple in front of a visiting bishop, you feel the weight of centuries of subtext. The bishop hesitates. He picks it up, turns it slowly. Does he sense the message? Or is he just hungry? You'll never know. But one thing's certain, fruit may perish quickly, but its meaning can linger for generations. A crowd gathers ahead, not around a noble or a knight, but a juggler. He's balancing on a barrel, bare feet calloused, cloak ragged at the hem, hair wild and wind-tangled. In one hand a banana, in the other a plum. And in his eyes, mischief. Welcome to Jugglers, Jesters, and the Weaponized Banana, where fruit wasn't just food or symbol. It was comedy, defiance, and sometimes a last-ditch attempt to avoid being trampled by a crowd of angry peasants. Street performers in the Middle Ages weren't always welcome, but they were often necessary. In towns choked with tax collectors, bad weather, and worse beer, jesters and jugglers were the spicy garnish on the bland porridge of daily life. They were walking satire, mocking laws, and, when it came down to it, mocking you if your shoes squeaked or your belly jiggled. And their favorite props? Fruit. It was cheap, it was dramatic, and if you juggled badly, it made a mess instead of a medical bill. Bananas, while rare and mostly imported through Moorish Spain, became infamous among traveling performers for one reason: shape. A juggler could hold it like a sword, point it like a wand, or, if things were getting truly chaotic, slip on it for a guaranteed laugh. Even then, slapstick worked. Always has. Always will. Quirky moment. In a 14th century fair in Valencia, a juggler named Sancho el Delgado gained fleeting fame by creating a one-man skit called The Judgment of the Melons. He played all three roles: a corrupt priest, a sleeping king, and a sentient melon on trial for harboring maggots. The crowd loved it. The church didn't. He fled to Genoa with only a barrel of figs and a wig made of onion skins. And don't think jesters restricted their fruity antics to open-air performances. In royal courts, where every word and twitch was subject to scrutiny, jesters used fruit as code. You couldn't openly insult the Queen's brother for, say, embezzling Abbey funds, but you could serve him a peach carved into the shape of a coin purse and say, "My lord, your investments bear fruit." Cue scattered laughter. Cue a dangerous glance from the Duke. Cue immediate exit. Open scholarly debate. Were jesters protected because they were considered fools, or tolerated because they were necessary pressure valves for tense political climates? Some argue their fruit-based jokes gave nobles plausible deniability. Oh, it's just jest. While others suggest the best jesters were anything but foolish, they were brilliant, subversive, often one peel away from a beheading. And if the fruit hit its mark, figuratively or literally, it could change a performer's entire fate. In the Hanseatic city of Lübeck, a performer known only as Cornfried the Clumsy once juggled 9 oranges in front of the mayor's entire family. On the final toss, one slipped and bounced directly into the lap of the mayor's spinster sister. She laughed, the mayor laughed, and just like that, Cornfried was hired as court fool, a position that lasted 3 weeks until he attempted to juggle pine cones and nearly blinded the bishop. But for most jesters, it wasn't about glory. It was about survival. In hostile towns or during tense feast days, fruit was both a shield and a sword. A performer might roast the village butcher, then immediately hand him a fig for your tender feelings. If tensions rose, the performer could pivot, juggle, slip, peel, pratfall, deflect. The humor disarmed, literally sometimes. Quirky fringe tradition. In several English towns, jesters performed what was known as the fruit gauntlet. They'd run through 2 lines of children armed with fruit, preferably soft, and dodge, dance, or collect thrown produce for their act. The better the performance, the fewer bruises. It was part trial, part sport, and part fruit recycling program. You pause now near the juggler. He's mid-routine, balancing an apple on his nose while tossing lemons between his elbows. The crowd roars. Then, with impeccable timing, he drops everything and proclaims, "Ah, my thoughts have spoiled like last year's apricots." Everyone laughs. Well, except one woman clutching a basket of apricots. Her brow tightens. Her husband shifts uneasily. A whisper spreads. This isn't just humor, it's commentary. You realize now, fruit allowed jesters to say what couldn't be said. If someone took offense, the jester could always shrug. "I was talking about fruit, my lord, not about your marriage, not about your taxes, certainly not about your missing cousin." Smile, toss a pear, run. Even the church got involved. In a sermon from Saxony dated 1365, one bishop declared, "Laughter is the devil's fig," which, frankly, sounds like the title of a very fun band. He went on to blame jesters for undermining respect for the nobility and turning sacred events into fruitless revels. Ironically, this sermon was later reprinted in a book with a grapevine motif on every page. So you move on, past the juggler, past the crowd, the taste of candied pear still lingering on your tongue. You pass a small boy juggling 3 walnuts and failing with glorious abandon. A young woman nearby laughs, tosses him a plum, he catches it and beams. Sometimes the joke is on everyone, and sometimes the joke is the only thing that keeps the world from collapsing. The streets are darker now, narrow and twisted, the laughter behind you fading into murmurs. You walk along a quiet canal lined with shuttered stalls, the air thick with damp wood and the faint scent of salt. A gondola slips by, silent. Somewhere nearby, a cat knocks over a peach pit with deliberate indifference. Welcome to the forbidden fruit, vendors of Venice, where fruit was currency, power, and sometimes contraband. Venice in the late Middle Ages was a city of paradoxes. It glittered with trade wealth and religious pomp, but beneath the marble arches, shadows lingered, forbidden books, questionable contracts, and curiously, forbidden fruit. While the rest of Europe chucked plums at priests and figs at fishmongers, Venice had something more potent: scarcity. In this floating city, space was precious, imports were everything, and fruit, especially exotic fruit, was tightly controlled. That made it ripe intended for smuggling, bribery, and highly charged insults that could upend reputations. Imagine this. A gondolier slides up to a merchant's back door. From beneath a plank, he pulls a crate wrapped in coarse linen. Inside, lemons. Not Venetian grown, but smuggled from Cyprus, where the soil's richer, the scent sharper. These weren't just lemons. They were statements. To serve them publicly, without approval from the guild, was like waving a counterfeit coin in the face of power. Historians still argue whether this smuggling network started with fruit vendors themselves, or if they were pawns in a larger merchant-class rebellion against guild overreach. Some say the forbidden fruit trade was fueled by women, widows and daughters who couldn't join official merchant leagues and carved their place in the back-alley economy. Others claim the Doge turned a blind eye as long as the fruit made its way to his table first. And here's the twist. These contraband fruits didn't just carry flavor, they carried messages. A sour orange placed on the desk of a rival, code for "I know what you did with the poor taxes." A bruised pomegranate, sent anonymously in a paper parcel, not a threat, but a reminder. I haven't forgotten. One surviving letter, unsigned, was discovered beneath floorboards in a disused dockside shop. It reads, "For every sweet you keep from the square, a sour shall find your doorstep." The melon knew. It sounds absurd. It also sounds exactly like Venice. Pokey fringe detail. In the San Polo district, there was a fruit cart so notorious for whispered transactions that locals called it La Bocca di Limone, the lemon's mouth. It was said you could buy anything there: candied citrus, secrets, even forged permissions to serve exotic plums at private dinners. Its location changed weekly. Payment? Always in fruit or favors. Fruit insults in Venice weren't shouted across the square, they were whispered, passed hand to hand like smoldering coals. One popular trick? Slipping an overripe grape into the hood of someone's cloak. It would burst eventually, somewhere awkward, socially sticky, deliciously humiliating. And, of course, the elites got involved. During a high-profile masquerade ball, a noblewoman known only as La Viola served fruit-themed desserts to her rival's husband. The pear tart was undercooked, the cherry compote too runny. But the lemon custard, that was perfect. Everyone noticed. Everyone whispered. The next morning, the husband left town. The noblewoman's name never reappeared in the official invitation. Fruit, as ever, had done the talking. Open scholarly debate. Was Venice's fruit drama unique due to its geography and mercantile culture, or was it simply better recorded because of the city's obsession with documentation? Some claim the same undercurrents existed in Genoa and Barcelona, just less flamboyantly. Others say Venice was the perfect storm, too wealthy to ignore, too corrupt to stop, too proud to admit it. One thing's clear: the fruit guilds took it seriously. Regulations were strict. Citron had to be inspected. Lemons couldn't be sold on feast days without a guild stamp. Grapes over a certain weight? Taxed. And vendors caught violating the rules weren't just fined, they were shamed. Punishment sometimes included fruit inversion, being made to wear a garland of spoiled produce in the market square while shouting an apology to all fruits misrepresented. There's even a report of a man forced to clean fish guts from the docks using only pomegranates. It was called sour penance. You walk now through a small archway into a courtyard glowing under lantern light. A young girl sits on a step, carving faces into quinces with a tiny knife. One has a crooked smile. Another, a single teardrop, carved in juice. She looks up at you but says nothing. Behind her, a shutter creaks closed. Fruit speaks, if you know how to listen. And in Venice, it never truly goes silent. You make your way out of the Venetian shadows and into the glow of an open square. Torchlight flickers across cobblestones as a puppet show begins. Just a wooden stage, a patchy curtain, and a painted sign that reads, "The Justice of the Apricot." A handful of children sit cross-legged. A man with a lute tunes gently. And beside the stage, a pile of very, very old apples. You've stumbled into the world of fruit tossing as satire and protest, where public performance and parody bloomed under the protective skin of comedy, and sometimes splattered across the feet of power. In a time when direct criticism could get you jailed, exiled, or, if the church was involved, politely incinerated, satire was survival. You didn't shout that the mayor was corrupt. You showed a puppet named Lord Apricot hoarding peaches while the townspeople starved. And when Lord Apricot slipped on a plum peel and fell into a symbolic pie, the crowd roared. No one said his name. Everyone knew. This kind of coded commentary became a medieval art form, whether on stage, in the margins of manuscripts, or through roaming minstrels. Performers and writers found ingenious ways to protest injustice with fruit, because you can't outlaw laughter. They tried. Historians still argue whether these performances actually shaped public policy or simply offered the illusion of power to the masses. Some believe they softened the sting of tyranny. Others think they were the first cracks in its shell. Let's talk manuscripts. Illuminated texts weren't all holy scenes and saintly halos. In the margins, what scholars call marginalia, scribes often added jokes, animal fables, and fruit insults. There's a famous example from a 14th century psalter where a monkey pelts a bishop with figs while riding a goose. It has no theological bearing, it's just very funny, and slightly scandalous. Also, excellent posture on the goose. These visual jokes weren't meaningless. They were statements, smuggled into sacred texts by scribes with ink-stained fingers and opinions they dared not voice. One book from Lincolnshire features an elaborate border of rotting pears, slowly overtaking the page, likely aimed at a particularly disliked prior whose sermons were, according to a side note, as nourishing as swamp broth. Quirky fringe detail. In Dijon, a group of traveling satirists performed a serialized stage piece called The Melon Monarchy. It depicted a royal court made entirely of fruit: Queen Pomegranate, Prince Nectarine, Chancellor Rhubarb. Each represented a real figure. The Duke, widely understood to be Chancellor Rhubarb, attempted to have them arrested. They slipped away. The next year they returned, with a sequel, The Rhubarb Revolt. These shows often ended in what was called a fruit verdict. The audience, if displeased, would throw fruit, not at the performers, but with them, toward an effigy or painted representation of the real target. One popular play from Toulouse ended with the entire audience pelting a painted tax collector with moldy grapes. The grape stains were left up for weeks. And let's not ignore the deeper artistry. A carved pear left at a bishop's residence, a plum tart sliced into the shape of a failing merchant's seal. Even baked goods participated. One baker in Mainz created a justice pie every Lent, with layers symbolizing hypocrisy, greed, and soft pastry leadership. Everyone laughed, except the local judge, who ordered a pie himself the next day. Interpretation unclear. Open scholarly debate. Were these acts tolerated because they offered comic relief, or because the authorities genuinely underestimated their power? Some scholars argue that rulers knew exactly what was going on and allowed it, thinking it kept the people docile. Others suggest that when satire became too sharp, it was quickly stamped out. The truth lies in the fruit bowl somewhere between, and sometimes satire bit back. One performance in Ghent featured a juggler mocking a baron's lavish spending by comparing his table to a spoiled market stall full of soft figs and no meat. The baron laughed. Then he stopped laughing. Then he had the juggler's cart confiscated. But the people remembered the line. It spread. By midsummer, soft fig feasting was common slang for gluttonous waste. Another in York told the tale of a vineyard ghost who punished liars by souring their grapes. The audience found it hilarious, especially since the local priest's vineyard had failed 3 years in a row. He swore it was coincidence. The children, however, began leaving shriveled raisins on his doorstep. And of course, there's the story of the Apricot Rebellion, a 3-day festival in a small alpine town where residents protested a new church tax by wearing fruit hats, singing "The Bishop's Banquet is Moldy," and staging mock sermons using pears as preachers. The bishop banned the song. It became even more popular. He banned apricots. The next year, someone built a life-size apricot out of bread and burned it in the square. Theatrical fruit flinging wasn't just about humor. It was resistance, a way to criticize without naming names, a method to hold a mirror, however sticky, to those in power. You stand now at the edge of the crowd. The puppet show ends. A melon rolls dramatically off stage, bouncing once, twice, landing beside your boot. You look down. Is it yours now? Is it a sign? A gift? Or maybe, just maybe, it's an invitation. You move through quieter streets now, your footsteps echoing over damp flagstones. A candle flickers in a second street window. Somewhere behind a shutter, someone sings a lullaby, soft, slow, off-key. You pause, glance down, and spot something curious on the doorstep of a narrow brick house. A melon, split in half, seeds glistening in the moonlight. Tonight's tale turns darker, softer at the edges, but no less potent. This is witchcraft, women, and the cursed melon. Where fruit became more than symbol or insult, it became power. In medieval Europe, fruit was not just something to eat, throw, or laugh about. It could be a charm, a curse, or a whispered spell wrapped in the flesh of a fig. And most often, the hands weaving these fruit-laced enchantment belonged to women. Witchcraft accusations in the Middle Ages weren't limited to cauldrons and broomsticks. Many began in kitchens and gardens, places where women spent most of their time. And among herbs and oils and whispered prayers, fruit played a curious role. Apples hung over doorways to ward off misfortune, pomegranates steeped in wine to preserve youth, a dried pear under the pillow to dream of one's future husband. But not all uses were gentle. In 15th century Bohemia, a widow named Mareta was accused of binding a man's affections through the cutting of a peach. According to the testimony, she carved his name into the fruit, soaked it in milk, and buried it at the crossroads. Weeks later, the man left his wife and moved into Mareta's home. Coincidence? Witchcraft? Or maybe he just liked milk-steeped peaches. Historians still argue. One quirky record from Lucerne tells of a woman tried for cursing a neighbor with a spoiled melon. The accusation? She left the melon, split and rotting beneath his window, and muttered, "Let your lies seed worms." Days later, his prized vineyard developed a fungal blight. Science, slander, superstition, hard to say, but the melon made it into the court documents with a sketch. Open scholarly debate. Were these fruit-based rituals truly magical practices, or were they just folk customs misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented by patriarchal institutions? Some scholars suggest many of the accused were simply herbalists or midwives practicing time-honored, harmless traditions. Others argue that symbols, especially fruit, were so emotionally charged in medieval society that any unconventional use of them could trigger fear and suspicion. And fruit had the perfect blend of beauty and decay for such fears. Take apples, for instance, a symbol of knowledge, yes, but also of temptation, of fall, of shame. A woman offering an apple in certain towns could be seen as seductive. A woman burning one in her hearth and chanting names, that might earn her a night in the stocks. In parts of the Baltics, it was believed that throwing a plum into someone's well could sour their luck for a year. In Brittany, carving a face into a quince and burying it in a neighbor's yard was said to cause them headaches, nightmares, or bad harvests, not because of poison, because of intent. One particularly eerie tradition involved weeping oranges. Women seeking vengeance would soak oranges in salted water while whispering their grievances, then leave them in public places. If the salt drew moisture and the fruit began to leak, it was said to carry the curse forward. Some say the practice began with imported Seville oranges, bitter, expensive, and slightly theatrical. And then there were the pomegranate seeds, counted, named, and placed one by one on doorsteps or grave markers. Each seed was said to carry a wish, a curse, or a warning. A woman in Catalonia reportedly left 7 seeds outside the local magistrate's home after he fined her for disrespectful bread pricing. He resigned 3 weeks later, citing unending dreams of red snowfall. Of course, not all fruit rituals were sinister. Many were protective. A ring of cherries around a child's cradle, a fig placed beneath a dying person's pillow to sweeten their crossing. But the line between blessing and blight was thin, and women who crossed it, intentionally or not, often paid the price. Quirky tradition. In the Tyrolean Alps, unmarried women would leave a pear on their windowsill each Midsummer's Eve. If it was gone by morning, legend said they'd marry within the year, but if the pear was returned, bruised, or sliced, it meant they'd been cursed with long spinsterhood, or simply a petty neighbor. You reach the edge of a quiet garden now, overgrown but cared for. You see shapes, small stone altars, pots of rosemary, bundles of dried citrus hanging from a line, and in the center, on a smooth, flat stone, sits a single blackened plum. It is perfectly still, yet it seems to watch. Did someone curse someone here? Or was it a memory ritual, a vigil, or simply fruit forgotten? You step lightly past it, because here, fruit was more than fruit. It was language, it was intent, it was a woman's voice in a world that often tried to silence her. And sometimes a cursed melon said more than 100 sermons. Morning fog coils around your ankles now, soft and slow, as you step onto the edge of a wide field. Far from the city's thrum, it's all birdsong, damp earth and rows of crooked trees, still heavy with fruit. A man in the distance balances a ladder against an apple tree. A woman beside him hums and sorts plums into baskets, good ones to market, bruised ones to somewhere else. Welcome to farms, fields, and feuds that turn juicy. where fruit didn't just insult, it festered, where generations nursed slights beneath apple boughs, where a bruised pear could spark a family grudge that lasted longer than a medieval bridge's repair schedule. In rural communities, fruit was life. It wasn't symbolic, it was literal survival, and that made it potent. Unlike nobles who flung figs for fun, farmers took their fruit seriously. But when insulted, wronged, or simply bored enough, they found ways to turn even harvests into weapons of pettiness. Start with the orchard line. In many villages, families marked property boundaries with fruit trees. One family might plant plum trees up to the hedge, another would answer with pears. But if someone's tree leaned too far over the invisible line, or if the roots spread greedily beneath the soil, that wasn't just overgrowth. That was an act of war. Historians still argue whether these tree-based feuds were more about land rights or simmering social rivalry. Some say families used tree placement to assert dominance. Others suggest the trees were excuses, fruit-bearing scapegoats for old slights, whispered insults, or stolen kisses, decades old. Take the case of the Brun family in western Normandy. In 1411, they accused their neighbors, the Picards, of trespass via pear. Specifically, the Bruns claimed that 2 overripe pears fell from a Picard branch and struck their son during morning chores. The boy was fine. The pears were not. The Bruns retaliated by hurling rotting apples into the Picard's well. The village priest had to intervene with a fruit fast. No produce on church grounds for a full worky record. In a Kentish hamlet, a woman named Marjorie kept detailed notes of fruit exchanges between her family and the one across the lane. Gave 2 plums, received 1 fig, soft, rude. Her final entry reads, tossed cherry pit over fence, awaiting response. Scholars believe it's the earliest recorded instance of passive-aggressive gardening. And then there were harvest time insults. Imagine. It's September. Your pears are ready. You've labored all year, pruned, prayed, protected against crows. Then, just before dawn, your neighbor walks his cow too close to the edge. It eats 3 pears. You see it. He sees you seeing it. He shrugs. The next day you accidentally dump a basket of split apricots on his doorstep. No words exchanged, everyone knows. Sometimes entire harvest festivals descended into fruit feuds. In Bavaria, an annual apple day was cancelled for 5 years straight after an incident involving spoiled cider, stolen recipes, and a poorly timed song about the worm in Widow Elsa's orchard. She had no worms. She did have a very sharp memory and access to gooseberries. Open scholarly debate. Were these rural fruit insults a reflection of actual economic disputes or deeply coded emotional warfare? Some anthropologists argue that in communities with little privacy and lots of interdependence, the smallest symbolic gesture, like returning a gifted peach with a bite already taken, was rich with meaning. Others insist people were just really bad at conflict resolution and had too much time during slow winter. Let's not forget family feuds passed down like heirloom recipes. One Flemish lineage reportedly forbade their children from marrying into the neighboring village because of a quince pie. The story goes, in 1303, a wedding feast was interrupted when a guest choked on an undercooked quince. The host accused the baker of sabotage. The baker accused the quince of poor breeding. The bride cried. The quince tree was chopped down. No one's married between the villages since. But not all farm fruit fights were angry. Some were elaborate jokes. One family in Cornwall planted an apricot tree beside their neighbor's outhouse, Every time it bore fruit, they left a note, "Your digestion is blessed." In return, their neighbors planted a cherry tree aimed directly at the family's bedroom window. The implication? Still debated. But the cherries were excellent. And then there's the ritual of fruit shaming. In some regions, farmers who failed to care properly for their trees were mocked by anonymous gifts, overripe plums tied to their gate, or tiny pears smeared in ash. One man received a basket of worm-eaten apples, labeled Nature's Complaint. He started pruning the next week. Bookie superstition. In parts of Wales, it was believed that fighting beneath a fruit tree would curse the season's yield. Villagers would relocate arguments to barns, streams, anywhere but under an apple branch. Of course, if you wanted to sabotage your neighbor's crop, you might arrange a loud, performative fight beneath his best pear tree. Oh no, I hope this doesn't cause blight. Now, as you pass a low wall, you spot a row of apples on the stone, each one slightly bruised, each one aligned perfectly. A child sits nearby, carving a plum with a stick. He hums a song too old to name. You don't ask, you just nod. Because here in the fields, fruit holds grudges, and memory, and occasionally forgiveness, though always in season. You return to town under a sky that's traded gold for steel. Rain is coming, not the gentle kind, but the sudden, slapping, ruin-your-plum-stand kind. Vendors pull cloth over their stalls. A man tips his cart, sending lemons tumbling into a ditch. You duck into a wooden arcade just as the first drops fall, landing with soft thuds on dusty stone. Just ahead, under shelter, two men argue in low voices beside a crate of pears. One points to a scroll, the other gestures at a bruised spot on the fruit. You're about to pass by, but then one of them says, "By the law of spoiled produce, that's a full fine." This is when law caught up with lemons, where the fruit fights of yore finally met ink, seal, and magistrate. For centuries, throwing fruit was part performance, part protest, part public sport. But as towns grew and systems evolved, local leaders began to tire of unregulated splatter, and so came the laws, odd, oddly specific, and utterly delightful. Take York, 1428. A city ordinance declares that no person shall with intent or malice hurl any citrus or soft fruit at a public officer, his beast, or his house, save on feast days. The exception, of course, being those occasions when everyone wanted to hurl something at the tax collector. Historians still argue whether these laws arose purely from safety concerns or as subtle attempts to suppress folk expression. After all, if you regulate the fruit, you regulate the message, and if your townspeople can't throw a fig without a permit, they might start asking trickier questions, like where their grain levy went. Some towns got creative. In the German city of Augsburg, fruit flinging was classified under symbolic assault, a legal category that also included offensive gestures with bread and disrespectful placement of sausage. That's not a joke. That's the Middle Ages. Open scholarly debate. Did these fruit laws actually reduce incidents of food-based insults, or simply formalize them into a kind of performative civil disobedience? Some believe that once rules existed, clever citizens used them as blueprints. "Ah," they'd say, "if I throw 2 lemons but no more, and only between the 3rd and 5th bell, I am not liable." Correct. Technically, let's talk penalties. Most towns didn't jail fruit throwers unless serious injury occurred. Instead, fines were levied, usually in coin but sometimes in kind. One Flemish man caught throwing spoiled pears, had a bishop's assistant, was sentenced to deliver 12 baskets of unbruised apples to the town infirmary. A poetic reversal. His punishment was fruit-based charity. In Venice, no surprise there, fines were exorbitant, especially if the fruit was foreign or sacred. One man caught tossing a citron during a sacred procession was fined the equivalent of a month's wages and had to scrub the cathedral steps with lemon slices. Irony, apparently, was alive and well. Whose quirky fringe case in 1465 in Marseille, a man was fined not for throwing a fruit, but for insulting the quality of a pear he refused to throw. He reportedly sneered, "This is too fine a specimen to waste on your face," while glaring at a rival merchant. The judge ruled it an implied act of aggression, fined him 4 sous, and confiscated the pear. The court record ends with the note, "Pear was later consumed by bailiff, unripe." Laws didn't just cover fruit tossing, they addressed fruit provocations. Leaving a melon on someone's doorstep? Legal if uncut, illegal if carved into a lewd shape. Carrying plums to a wedding not your own? Acceptable unless you tied them to a black ribbon. That symbolized infidelity. Yes, really. In some cities, fruit disputes became full-court dramas. Imagine it, a dusty chamber, a magistrate with ink on his sleeves, 2 farmers glaring at each other across a wormy crate. One claims the fruit was hurled, the other says it slipped. Witnesses are called, a child mimics the throw, a baker testifies he heard a thump most intentional. In the end, the judge rules that the pear was launched with mood and levies a half-day's wage in fines. You may laugh, but these transcripts survive. They read like plays, theatrical, passionate, occasionally sticky, and they show how seriously people took the language of fruit. It wasn't just mess, it was messaging. Some towns tried to stamp it out entirely. A 15th century edict from Milan banned all produce-based performances during Holy Week. The result? An uptick in root vegetable incidents, carrots in pews, parsnips at priests. The fruit might have been banned, but the spirit still squirming in a turnip. Even in death, fruit made trouble. One Londoner left his pear orchard to his grandson on the condition he never weaponized the harvest. Naturally, the boy became notorious for using overripe pears to settle gambling debts. The orchard was later seized by the city for moral disrepair. And let's not forget fruit lawyers. Yes, that's a phrase. Some notaries developed reputations for mediating produce disputes. There's a delightful mention of Martinus, negotiator of fruits and other misconduct, in a Dijon record. He reportedly once resolved a 3-family feud by organizing a communal cider pressing and forcing the participants to drink together until someone apologized. Now, as the rain lets up, you step into the square again. A cart has overturned, plums everywhere. A woman gathers them silently. A man joins her. Neither speaks. But between them lies a broken pear, flattened. You wonder, was this an accident? A message? A crime? You'll never know. But someone, somewhere, is already writing the fine. Dawn rolls over the town like spilled cream, soft and golden, pooling on window sills and rooftops. The streets are nearly empty now. Just a few merchants setting up carts, sweeping yesterday's stories into the gutters. You walk slowly, half dreaming, past the chapel, the bakery, the alley where someone once lobbed a lemon and changed a mayor's fate. And here we are, the final toss. Fruit as legacy and laughter. You've made it through orchards of insult and vineyards of vengeance. You've watched puppets hurl plums and monks carve moral figs. You've stepped over weaponized bananas and into the shadow of laws that tried and often failed to stop the squish. And now, here, with dew clinging to the cobbles and your shoes sticky from yesterday's cider spill, you understand something. Fruit was never just fruit. It was communication. It was cultural code. It was comedy and community. Even now, scholars puzzle over how such an ordinary object, sweet, bruisable, biodegradable, could carry so much meaning. Why a pear and not a stone? Why a fig and not a fist? The answer is slippery, like a peach in August, but perhaps it lies in who got to throw it. Fruit belonged to everyone, from abbots to fishwives, farmers to fools. If you had a pomegranate and an opinion, you had a voice. In a society thick with walls, class, church, gender, law, fruit slipped through. It gave you distance, deniability, drama. It let you express what couldn't be written, shouted, or survived. One quirky tale, tucked into a 15th century almanac from Siena, tells of a boy who tossed an apricot at a pompous knight during a midsummer parade. The knight, dismounting furiously, slipped on the fruit, fell, and broke his nose. The boy fled, but the crowd, roaring with laughter, began hurling fruit of their own. At the knight, at each other, into the air. The parade became a party. The knight never returned. The apricot tree outside town was declared blessed. Open scholarly debate. Was this mass participation a sign of resistance, or just a love of chaos? Was it political theater or group therapy? Historians argue. Artists nod. Children for centuries afterwards simply played apricot night in the fields, toppling each other with imaginary fruit. And the echoes remain, not just in court records or illuminated margins, but in every food fight, carnival toss, or stage gag that ends in citrus, the slapstick of Chaplin, the banana peels of cartoons, the custard pies, all of it fruit-flavored memory. Even today, public protest sometimes smells like produce, tomatoes thrown at bad politicians, oranges waved at rallies, a grapefruit left quietly on a courtroom step. Modern? Yes, but medieval at heart. Because what is a thrown fruit if not a joke, a jab, a gesture? You pass the tavern now. Outside, stacked crates of apples wait to be sold, each one perfect, each one with the potential to become more than breakfast. And next to them, an older man hands a boy a small, misshapen pear. The boy raises an eyebrow. Not for eating, the man says, smiling, for learning. You understand. Fruit is legacy. The stories we tell through it, with it, against it, endure. A single peach, tossed with perfect timing, can still shift a crowd. A fig left on a doorstep can still bruise the heart. And when laughter follows, and that's how you know the message landed. So now, as you find a place to sit on a worn stone bench beneath a sleepy fig tree, let your breath slow. Let the morning bird song drift in around you like soft fabric. The town is stirring, but gently. No chaos, no crowds, just the low hum of footsteps and rustling leaves. You trace a fingertip over a peach's soft skin. It yields slightly under your touch, warm from the sun, smelling of summer, of syrup, of simplicity. You don't need to throw it. You don't need to say anything at all, because this journey was never about fruit alone. It was about how people speak when words fail them, how a pear in a jester's hand becomes sharper than satire, how a cherry pie tells a whole town someone's heart has turned, how a single banana can draw laughter from silence. There's peace in that, oddly, in knowing even the messiest things, plums, pomegranates, peels, had meaning, were chosen, were flung with intent, and received with understanding. So close your eyes for a moment. Let the quiet settle into your chest. Let the orchard fade, the crowd hush, the fig tree hold its fruit just a little longer. You are safe here. No melons fly, no plums accuse, just air and light, and maybe a pear ripening on the branch. The story is done. The fruit has been thrown. Rest well.